He left her bleeding and broken. Then Alpha King read her last message. His reply changed everything. What could have been written in that final message? And what kind of reply could possibly change everything after a moment like that? Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy emotional Alpha King and Omega stories filled with mystery, redemption and unforgettable twists, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for spending your time with us and for supporting this channel with every view, like and comment. Before we begin, tell us in the comments. If you received one final message that could change everything, what would you say? Now settle in, take a deep breath, and let the story begin where every life-changing decision starts. Sometimes the last message is not written to save a life, but to reveal the truth after hope has already faded. Snow drifted silently across the abandoned forest road, covering the frozen earth with a blanket so pure it seemed impossible that sorrow could exist beneath it. Claire Bennett lay motionless beside the narrow trail, her pale winter coat torn by the harsh journey through the woods, her golden hair scattered across the snow like strands of faded sunlight. The cold pressed against her with quiet determination, stealing warmth one slow breath at a time, while the distant whisper of pine trees swayed beneath a gray winter sky. She could no longer hear the footsteps of the man who had walked away only minutes earlier. He had never looked back. That truth settled more heavily upon her heart than the bitter air surrounding her. She had trusted him with everything she possessed, believing every promise he had spoken beneath the moonlit nights they once shared. She had believed loyalty would be returned with loyalty. Instead, she had been left completely alone in a place where no traveler would willingly venture during the middle of winter. Her trembling fingers slowly searched the pocket of her coat until they found the small cell phone she had almost forgotten she carried. The screen glowed faintly as snowflakes melted against the cracked glass. The battery icon flashed red. Only a few moments of power remained. Claire stared at the contacts stored inside the device. Familiar names filled the screen, each one representing someone she had once trusted. Friends who had stopped answering her calls. Neighbors who no longer believed her voice. People who had chosen rumors instead of memories. One by one, she quietly passed each name without pressing the call button. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to defend. Then her eyes rested upon a name she had never expected to use. Alpha King Adrian Ashford. She had never met him. She had never stood inside his palace or spoken with him face to face. Months earlier, during a public royal address broadcast across every pack, his office had encouraged citizens to report injustice directly if every other path had failed. At the time, Claire had dismissed the message as something meant for stronger people, not someone like her. Yet now, with silence surrounding her and every other door already closed, those words quietly returned. She opened a blank message. Her hands shook so badly that several letters appeared incorrectly before she erased them. She did not write accusations. She did not beg for rescue. She did not ask for revenge against the person who had abandoned her. Instead, she simply apologized for disturbing the Alpha King, explained that she feared the truth might disappear with her if no one ever heard it, and ended with a sentence so simple it almost disappeared beneath the falling snow. If this reaches you, thank you for reading. Claire stared at the glowing screen for one final heartbeat before pressing send. The message disappeared into the silent winter morning as the battery finally went dark, leaving only endless white snow, quiet pine trees, and a question neither she nor anyone else could yet answer. The message vanished into the empty signal beyond the mountains, but Claire Bennett never saw whether it had been delivered. The dark screen reflected only the pale sky above her before her fingers slowly loosened around the silent phone. Snow continued drifting through the evergreen branches, covering every footprint left along the narrow trail. Except one fading set leading away from her. Somewhere beyond those frozen woods, life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened, yet only 24 hours earlier everything had seemed wonderfully ordinary. Claire had awakened before sunrise inside the small cottage she had called home since childhood. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the kitchen as morning light painted warm patterns across the wooden floor. She had always loved quiet mornings like that, when the world still felt honest before rumors and expectations found their voices. She smiled as she carefully wrapped homemade pastries in a linen cloth, intending to deliver them to an elderly widow who lived nearly 2 miles outside the village. It was a habit Claire had never spoken about because kindness had always felt more meaningful when no one noticed it. The widow greeted her with grateful eyes, insisting Claire stay for tea, but Claire politely declined because someone else was already waiting. On her walk back through town, she stopped to help a young boy retrieve scattered books after a sudden gust of wind swept them across the street. She repaired a loose wooden sign outside the bakery without being asked and carried 2 heavy buckets of water to an aging shopkeeper whose aching knees no longer allowed him to make the trip easily. None of those small acts earned applause. Most passed without a single word of thanks. Claire had long ago accepted that genuine kindness rarely arrived with recognition. By late afternoon she stood beside the frozen river where she had promised to meet the man she believed would soon become her future. He greeted her with the same gentle smile that had once convinced her she could finally trust someone completely. During the past year he had listened patiently whenever fear or loneliness crept into her thoughts. He had spoken of building a peaceful life together somewhere beyond the endless whispers that followed her because she was an Omega. Every promise sounded sincere. Every reassuring glance seemed impossible to doubt. Looking back now, Claire would later realize that the most dangerous lies often arrived wrapped inside familiar comfort, rather than obvious cruelty. As the afternoon slowly disappeared beneath gathering clouds, he suggested they leave the village behind for a private walk through the snow-covered forest. He said he wanted to show her the place where they could begin their new future together. Claire followed without hesitation, believing every step carried her closer to hope instead of heartbreak. The deeper they traveled beneath the towering pines, the quieter the world became. Birds disappeared. Even the wind seemed to retreat into uneasy silence. Claire noticed the change but dismissed the growing uneasiness inside her heart, because trust had taught her to ignore instincts that now begged her to stop walking. She smiled anyway, believing love required faith. She had no way of knowing that before another sunrise arrived, every promise she had treasured would become nothing more than an echo carried away by the winter wind. The forest welcomed them with a silence so complete that even their footsteps seemed reluctant to disturb it. Snow rested upon towering pine branches, and the fading afternoon sun filtered through them in long ribbons of pale gold that painted the narrow trail ahead. Claire Bennett walked beside the man she loved with quiet confidence, believing she was leaving behind every lonely chapter of her past. Whenever she glanced toward him, he answered with the familiar smile that had slowly earned her trust over the past year. He spoke about the small cabin they would someday build near a peaceful lake, where no one would judge her for being an Omega, and where they could finally begin a life untouched by endless gossip. His words sounded so natural that Claire could almost picture the warm glow of a fireplace reflected across frozen water, while snow drifted gently outside. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of other people's opinions that the possibility of simply belonging somewhere felt almost miraculous. They eventually arrived at a quiet clearing surrounded by tall evergreens. The place was beautiful in the soft winter light, untouched except for a weathered wooden bench overlooking a narrow stream that had begun to freeze beneath the dropping temperature. Claire smiled as she admired the peaceful view, but when she turned to share the moment, she noticed something unfamiliar in his expression. The warmth she had always recognized had quietly disappeared. In its place rested a calm distance she had never seen before. Before she could ask what was wrong, he slowly reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a folded envelope. He handed it to her without speaking. Confused, Claire unfolded the paper and stared at the neatly written pages inside. Her heart gradually sank with every line she read. The document falsely claimed that she had willingly accepted responsibility for several recent disputes within the local pack, along with financial records that had mysteriously disappeared. None of it reflected the truth. The handwriting was not hers. The accusations described events she had never witnessed. She looked up in disbelief, expecting him to explain the terrible mistake, but instead he quietly admitted that the village council had needed someone to blame before the coming leadership gathering. The community wanted peace restored, investors reassured, and questions silenced before neighboring packs arrived. An isolated Omega without powerful relatives had become the easiest answer. Claire could barely understand what she was hearing. She reminded him of every promise they had made together, every conversation beneath the stars, every future they had imagined side by side. He listened without anger, but neither did he show regret. His voice remained almost emotionless as he explained that sometimes people sacrifice one future to protect many others. He insisted that history would eventually forget her name, while the village would survive because someone had accepted the burden. Claire stared at him as though looking at a complete stranger wearing the face of the man she had loved. The cold winter air suddenly felt sharper than before, yet it was not the temperature that made her shiver. It was the realization that trust could disappear in a single conversation. As daylight slowly faded behind the snow-covered trees, he took one final step backward, leaving the false confession resting in Claire's trembling hands. Without another promise, without another explanation, he quietly turned toward the forest trail. Claire remained standing in the silent clearing, unable to convince herself that the footsteps growing fainter through the snow were carrying away the only person she had ever believed would never leave. Claire Bennett remained frozen long after the final sound of his footsteps disappeared into the endless forest. The folded confession rested loosely in her hands, its carefully written lies growing heavier with every passing second. Around her, the clearing looked exactly as it had only minutes before. Snow still rested peacefully upon the evergreen branches. The narrow stream continued flowing beneath a thin layer of ice. Nothing in the quiet landscape reflected the invisible moment when an entire future had quietly collapsed. She read the document again, hoping she had misunderstood its meaning, but every sentence remained painfully clear. Someone had planned this long before she arrived. The signatures had already been prepared. Witness statements had already been gathered. Official seals had already been placed upon the pages. She realized with growing disbelief that her role had never been to tell the truth. It had simply been to disappear beneath a story someone else had carefully written. Claire folded the papers with trembling hands and hurried back toward the trail, convinced she could still reach him before he vanished completely. She called his name once, then again. Her voice drifted between the towering pines before fading into empty silence. No answer returned. She continued walking faster, following the fresh footprints left across the untouched snow. But after several minutes the trail unexpectedly divided into multiple directions where the wind had begun covering every mark. She stopped, turning slowly in a full circle. Every path looked almost identical. The forest that had seemed welcoming only an hour earlier now surrounded her with unfamiliar stillness. She reached for her phone, hoping to call someone from the village despite everything that had happened. One by one she selected familiar names. Every attempt ended the same way. Some calls went unanswered. Others disconnected almost immediately. A few numbers no longer accepted incoming calls at all. Claire lowered the phone and stared quietly at the screen. She could not decide which hurt more, the silence itself or the realization that so many people had already decided she no longer deserved to be heard. The afternoon light continued fading, painting the snowy woods in shades of pale blue and gray. The temperature dropped quickly as a cold wind swept between the trees. Claire wrapped her coat tighter around herself and began walking again, searching for any familiar landmark that might guide her back toward the village. Instead, every mile seemed to carry her farther from safety. Even the birds had disappeared, leaving only the soft whisper of snowflakes drifting through the branches overhead. Her breathing grew slower as exhaustion quietly settled into every step. She found herself remembering the royal address she had watched months earlier inside the crowded village hall. Alpha King Adrian Ashford had spoken not as a distant ruler, but as someone who believed every citizen deserved the chance to be heard before judgment was passed. At the time, the speech had seemed comforting yet impossibly far away from her ordinary life. Now those words returned with surprising clarity, standing in sharp contrast to everything she had experienced during the past few hours. Claire glanced once more at the nearly empty battery icon glowing faintly on her phone. Every practical choice had already disappeared. Every familiar voice had fallen silent. As the first stars slowly appeared above the snow-covered forest, one final possibility quietly emerged in her mind, fragile enough to feel almost impossible, yet impossible to ignore. The fragile hope that had quietly taken shape inside Claire Bennett's heart refused to disappear, even as the winter night settled over the forest with relentless determination. She leaned against the rough trunk of a towering pine tree, trying to steady her breathing while the cold continued creeping through every layer of her clothing. Her hands had grown numb, yet she carefully held the small cell phone as though it were the last connection between herself and a world that had already turned away. The battery indicator blinked once more, warning that only moments of power remained. Claire closed her eyes and remembered the words Alpha King Adrian Ashford had spoken during the royal address months earlier. He had looked directly into the camera and said that justice began with listening, especially when every other voice had already decided the outcome. Those words had sounded sincere then, but sincerity often belonged to people who lived impossibly far away from ordinary lives. She had never imagined she would one day place her final hope in someone she had never met. Slowly, she unlocked the phone and searched through the official public directory until she found the emergency contact provided by the Crown for reports of injustice. Her fingers hesitated above the screen. She almost put the phone away again. Why would the Alpha King believe a stranger when her own village no longer believed her? Why would someone responsible for an entire kingdom stop to read a message from one forgotten Omega trapped inside a snow-covered forest? The questions lingered for several long seconds, but another thought quietly answered them. If she remained silent now, the lies written about her would become permanent. Future generations would never know that someone had tried to tell the truth. Claire opened a new message and stared at the blank screen. At first she considered describing every betrayal in painful detail, naming everyone involved and explaining each accusation one by one. Instead, she slowly erased every sentence. She realized that desperate words often became difficult to trust, especially when written by someone facing overwhelming fear. So she chose honesty over emotion. She introduced herself simply as Claire Bennett, an Omega from a small northern pack. She explained that official documents had been created using false statements, and that she feared those records would soon become accepted as truth. She admitted she had no evidence strong enough to defend herself alone, only the hope that someone willing to investigate might still discover what really happened. She did not accuse the man who had abandoned her by name. She did not ask the Alpha King to punish anyone. She asked only for the truth to be given a chance before judgment became permanent. Then she paused, watching the blinking cursor beneath her final sentence. There was only enough battery left for a few more words. A quiet smile, touched with exhaustion rather than hope, crossed her face as she typed the last line. If this message reaches you, thank you for reading. Claire pressed send. For one long heartbeat, the phone displayed nothing except a spinning symbol searching for a signal beyond the frozen mountains. Then, with a soft vibration, the message disappeared from the screen. Before she could see anything else, the battery finally surrendered, leaving the display completely dark. Claire wrapped both hands around the silent phone and looked toward the endless forest stretching beneath the moonlit sky. Somewhere beyond the snow, beyond the mountains, and beyond every rumor that had stolen her future, one message was traveling toward a man whose next decision would change far more than either of them could possibly imagine. Hundreds of miles away, where towering stone walls overlooked snow-covered valleys and the banners of every allied pack moved gently beneath the winter wind, Alpha King Adrian Ashford sat inside the Eastern Council chamber as another long day of royal meetings approached its conclusion. The great hall reflected quiet strength rather than unnecessary luxury. Massive windows welcomed the pale afternoon light. Polished oak tables displayed carefully organized reports from every province, and a large fireplace filled the chamber with comforting warmth against the bitter season outside. Advisors discussed trade routes, border patrol schedules, and preparations for the annual gathering of regional leaders. Adrian listened patiently, asking thoughtful questions whenever a decision affected the lives of ordinary citizens. Those who served beside him had long learned that their king rarely rushed important judgments. He believed fairness demanded time, even when others preferred quick conclusions. Just as the final report was about to begin, a discreet vibration interrupted the silence. The royal communications officer, seated near the entrance, glanced down at the secure emergency network connected directly to the Crown's public justice line. Such notifications appeared only when someone submitted a message through the official channel, established for citizens who believed every local authority had failed them. Most reports arrived during normal business hours. Very few appeared after sunset. The officer quietly approached the council table and bowed before placing a secure tablet beside the Alpha King. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "this message has been flagged by the emergency review system." Adrian acknowledged the report with a calm nod before opening the encrypted message. The room gradually fell silent. His advisors recognized the familiar expression that crossed his face whenever he reviewed matters involving justice rather than politics. He began reading. The first lines introduced a woman named Claire Bennett, an Omega from a northern pack. Nothing unusual there. Similar requests reached the palace throughout the year. Then he continued. She did not ask for protection. She did not demand punishment for anyone. She did not plead for sympathy. Instead, she explained that false records had been created, and that she feared the truth would disappear if no one investigated before judgment became permanent. Adrian slowly reread that sentence. It lingered in his thoughts with unexpected weight. Most desperate messages focused upon fear. Claire's focused upon truth. He continued reading until he reached the final line. If this message reaches you, thank you for reading. Adrian did not immediately set the tablet aside. He quietly read the sentence again. There was no anger within it. No attempt to manipulate emotions. Only quiet gratitude from someone who seemed uncertain whether another human being would ever hear her voice. The Alpha King leaned back slightly in his chair while the chamber remained completely silent around him. Years of leadership had taught him that people who invented elaborate stories often filled pages with dramatic accusations. This message felt remarkably different. It was concise, restrained, and almost apologetic. His eyes drifted toward the transmission details displayed beneath the message. The communication had originated from a remote forest region near the northern boundary, and according to the system log, the sending device had gone offline only seconds after transmission. Adrian's expression grew noticeably more thoughtful. Without looking away from the screen, he asked one calm question that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the chamber. Who has jurisdiction over that northern pack, and why has no report about this matter reached the crown before today? No one answered the Alpha King's question immediately. The council chamber remained perfectly still as advisors exchanged uncertain glances, each silently searching their memory for any report connected to the northern pack Claire Bennett had mentioned. At last, the Royal Chancellor carefully opened a leather portfolio containing regional correspondence from the past several months. One document after another was reviewed beneath the warm glow of brass lamps, yet none contained a formal complaint matching the message Adrian had just received. Instead, the only recent communication from the Northern Territory described stable leadership, peaceful conditions, and successful preparations for the upcoming gathering of regional representatives. Everything appeared orderly on paper. Adrian quietly compared those official reports with the brief message still displayed on the secure tablet. The difference between the two accounts immediately caught his attention. Official documents spoke with complete confidence. Claire's message carried uncertainty, humility, and an almost reluctant request for someone to simply look closer. Experience had taught him that absolute certainty often deserved more scrutiny than quiet honesty. He placed the tablet upon the council table and looked toward the Director of Royal Intelligence. When was the last independent inspection of that territory? The director consulted another file before answering. Nearly 14 months ago, Your Majesty. The local council has consistently reported that no royal intervention has been necessary. Adrian gave a thoughtful nod but did not speak for several moments. He walked toward the enormous window overlooking the palace courtyard where fresh snow continued falling beneath lantern light. Members of the royal guard crossed the grounds with calm discipline while stable hands prepared horses for the evening patrol. Everything outside reflected careful order, yet the message resting behind him suggested that somewhere beyond those mountains another reality might exist entirely unseen. Turning back toward the chamber, Adrian requested the complete transmission record. The communications officer quickly projected the technical details onto a nearby display. The emergency system had automatically preserved the signal route, approximate location, battery status, and transmission quality. One detail immediately stood apart. Claire's phone had remained connected only long enough to send a single message before losing power completely. There had been no follow-up communication, no repeated attempts, no additional explanation. Adrian quietly folded his arms. Someone inventing a story usually continued sending messages whenever possible. Claire had written only once. Her restraint carried unexpected credibility. The Royal Chancellor finally broke the silence. Your Majesty, Would you like us to request clarification from the local council? Adrian slowly shook his head. If her message is accurate, notifying the same authorities she fears would accomplish nothing except giving them time to prepare answers. Several advisors immediately understood his reasoning. Information could be altered. Records could be rewritten. Witnesses could influence one another before investigators arrived. Truth often disappeared after people learned they were about to be questioned. Adrian looked once more at Claire's final sentence. If this message reaches you, thank you for reading. He found himself wondering why a person facing such overwhelming circumstances would spend her final words expressing gratitude instead of anger. That single choice revealed more about her character than any official report could. He turned toward the captain of the royal guard whose polished silver insignia reflected the firelight across the chamber. Prepare a small escort, Adrian said calmly. No public announcement. No advance notice to the Northern Council. We leave before sunrise. A quiet wave of surprise moved through the room. The Alpha King rarely traveled without extensive planning, yet no one questioned the order. As the captain bowed and departed to make preparations, Adrian glanced once more toward the dark mountains visible beyond the palace walls. Somewhere beneath that endless winter sky, a stranger had trusted him with her last remaining hope, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he had already decided that hope deserved an answer. Before the first light of dawn reached the palace towers, the royal courtyard had already awakened beneath a sky filled with drifting snow. Stable lanterns cast warm circles of light across the frozen stone, while members of the royal guard quietly prepared a small traveling party. Unlike ceremonial processions that announced the Alpha King's arrival days in advance, this departure carried no banners, no musicians, and no royal fanfare. Adrian Ashford had ordered absolute discretion. Only 6 trusted guards, the captain of the escort, and 1 royal investigator would accompany him north. The fewer people who knew about the journey, the less opportunity anyone would have to conceal the truth before they arrived. Adrian stepped into the courtyard wearing a dark winter cloak lined with gray fur, its silver clasp reflecting the faint glow of morning lanterns. He paused only long enough to study the weather stretching beyond the palace walls. Thick clouds covered the eastern horizon, promising another day of steady snowfall. The captain respectfully approached and confirmed that supplies for several days had been secured, additional winter blankets packed, and emergency medical equipment included among the provisions. Adrian acknowledged each detail with a quiet nod before mounting his horse. He gave only one final instruction. We stop for no ceremonies. We answer no invitations. We travel directly to the last recorded location of that message. Moments later, the palace gates slowly opened, allowing the small escort to disappear into the silent winter landscape before sunrise colored the sky. Far to the north, Claire Bennett remained where exhaustion had finally forced her to rest beneath the shelter of an ancient pine tree. She had gathered fallen evergreen branches around herself to lessen the bitter wind, though they offered little protection against the dropping temperature. The forest remained hauntingly peaceful. Snow continued falling in slow, graceful patterns, covering the ground until every direction appeared almost identical. Claire no longer tried to estimate how much time had passed since her phone lost power. Instead, she watched pale morning light gradually brighten the distant treetops while listening to the quiet rhythm of the forest awakening around her. A pair of small birds briefly landed upon a nearby branch before disappearing deeper into the woods. Somewhere farther away, a narrow stream continued flowing beneath thin sheets of ice. Those simple sounds reminded her that life still moved forward, even when her own future seemed suspended between hope and uncertainty. She gently reached into her coat pocket and wrapped her fingers around the powerless phone. It had become more than an object. It was the final proof that she had not surrendered without trying to tell the truth. She wondered whether the message had reached anyone at all. Perhaps it had vanished somewhere between distant communication towers. Perhaps an assistant had dismissed it before anyone important ever saw it. Or perhaps the Alpha King himself had already forgotten it among countless other responsibilities. Claire quietly smiled at the last possibility. She realized she had never truly expected a reply. Sending the message had never been about certainty. It had been about refusing to let silence become the final version of her story. Hundreds of miles away, Adrian guided his horse along a narrow mountain road as fresh snow softened every sound beneath the steady rhythm of moving hooves. The secure tablet containing Claire's message rested safely inside his saddlebag, yet he found himself remembering every line without needing to read it again. Most official reports faded from memory after careful review. This one remained unexpectedly clear. As the northern mountains slowly rose through the falling snow ahead, Adrian could not explain why a stranger's quiet words continued echoing through his thoughts, but he knew one thing with complete certainty. Somewhere beyond those white-covered forests, someone was still waiting for an answer. By late afternoon, the northern mountains stood like silent guardians beneath a sky of endless gray, their snow-covered peaks fading into drifting clouds as Alpha King Adrian Ashford and his small escort followed the final coordinates recorded by the emergency transmission. The narrow trail had almost disappeared beneath fresh snowfall, forcing the horses to slow as they entered the dense pine forest where Claire Bennett's message had originated. The royal investigator compared the secure tablet with a detailed topographic map, carefully measuring distance and elevation before pointing toward a secluded valley hidden beyond towering evergreens. Adrian guided his horse forward without hesitation, noticing how unusually untouched the landscape appeared. There were no fresh wagon tracks, no smoke rising from nearby cabins, and no signs that anyone had traveled through the area since the previous evening. The stillness carried an unsettling quality that quietly demanded attention. Several miles away, Claire remained beneath the shelter of the ancient pine tree where she had spent the long winter night. Her strength had slowly faded with every passing hour, yet she continued watching the distant forest trail whenever the wind shifted the falling snow. She no longer expected familiar faces to appear. Every person she had once trusted had already chosen another story. Even so, she found herself listening to every faint sound drifting through the woods, unable to silence the smallest hope that someone, somewhere, might have received her message. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Snowflakes continued settling across her coat until they almost blended with the white ground surrounding her. She quietly brushed them away, more from habit than necessity, then closed her eyes for a brief moment to gather enough strength to stand again. Remaining still for too long allowed the cold to settle deeper, and she refused to surrender while she could still take another step. Using the rough bark of the pine tree for support, she slowly rose to her feet. The world briefly swayed before steadying once more. Claire wrapped her arms around herself and looked toward the narrow trail disappearing between the trees. At first she believed the distant sound belonged to the wind echoing across the valley. Then she heard it again. Soft, rhythmic, almost too faint to trust. She remained perfectly still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might make the sound disappear. A few moments later it returned, clearer than before. The unmistakable rhythm of horses traveling through deep snow. Her heart began beating faster, not from certainty but from cautious disbelief. She had imagined rescue so many times during the endless night that she no longer trusted her own expectations. Farther down the forest trail, Adrian suddenly raised one gloved hand, signaling the escort to stop. The captain immediately recognized the gesture. Every rider fell silent. Adrian had noticed something unusual near the edge of the path. Partially covered by fresh snow rested a single folded sheet of paper. Carefully lifting it from the ground, he unfolded the damp document and studied its contents. It was an unsigned confession filled with accusations against Claire Bennett. Yet the handwriting looked strangely inconsistent, as though portions had been written by different people. The Alpha King's expression became noticeably more focused. Looking beyond the document, he noticed another detail almost hidden beneath the snow. A second trail of footprints, lighter and smaller, led away from the clearing before gradually disappearing beneath the latest snowfall. Adrian quietly folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. Then he lifted his eyes toward the silent forest ahead. Somewhere beyond those towering pines, someone who had almost disappeared beneath another person's carefully written lie was still waiting to learn whether her final message had truly reached the one person willing to listen. Adrian Ashford slipped the damp confession carefully inside his coat before stepping down from his horse, his boots sinking several inches into the fresh snow. The forest seemed to hold its breath around him. Even the steady wind moving through the towering pines had softened into an uneasy whisper, as though the wilderness itself were waiting to see what he would discover next. Kneeling beside the faint trail of footprints, he studied their direction with quiet concentration. They were smaller than the prints left by the person who had abandoned the clearing and noticeably uneven, suggesting someone had struggled to maintain balance while walking across the frozen ground. The newest snowfall had nearly erased them, yet enough remained to reveal one important truth. Whoever had left those tracks had continued moving instead of surrendering to despair. Adrian slowly stood and looked toward the captain of the Royal Guard. "She is still trying to survive," he said calmly. "We continue on foot from here." Without hesitation, the guard secured the horses beneath the shelter of nearby evergreens before following the Alpha King deeper into the silent forest. Every step carried them farther from the narrow mountain trail and closer to untouched wilderness where only scattered animal tracks interrupted the endless blanket of snow. The royal investigator carefully marked each clue they encountered. A broken evergreen branch bent at shoulder height. A shallow footprint preserved beneath the roots of an old pine. Tiny drops of melted snow where someone had rested briefly against a tree before continuing forward. None of the signs alone revealed much, but together they formed a quiet story of remarkable determination. Claire Bennett had refused to stop walking for as long as her strength allowed. Several hundred yards ahead, Claire leaned against another ancient pine, her breathing slow but steady as she listened once again to the distant rhythm she had almost convinced herself was imaginary. The sound had grown stronger now. Hoofs. More than one horse. Then silence. She frowned slightly. If riders had truly entered the forest, why had they stopped? The quiet that followed felt strangely deliberate rather than empty. Claire remained motionless, uncertain whether to call out or remain hidden. Fear still lingered inside her after everything that had happened. Trust no longer came easily. She closed her eyes and listened again. This time she heard something different. The soft crunch of footsteps moving carefully through deep snow. Not hurried. Not searching blindly. Measured. Patient. Somewhere nearby, voices exchanged only a few quiet words before falling silent again. Claire opened her eyes and looked toward the trees where pale afternoon light filtered through drifting snow. A dark figure gradually emerged between the towering pines, followed by several others maintaining a respectful distance behind him. The man walking in front wore a long winter cloak fastened with a silver clasp that reflected the fading daylight. His calm posture carried quiet authority without needing to announce itself. Claire recognized him immediately from the royal broadcasts she had watched months before inside the village hall. Her first instinct was disbelief. She wondered whether exhaustion had finally blurred the line between memory and reality. The figure stopped several feet away instead of approaching any closer. His blue-gray eyes rested upon her with calm attention, neither filled with suspicion nor pity. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The forest remained wonderfully still around them. Finally, Adrian broke the silence with the same steady voice that had once reached every corner of the kingdom through a public address. "Claire Bennett," he said gently, "I received your message." Those 4 quiet words settled over the snowy clearing more powerfully than any grand declaration could have. Claire's fingers tightened around the powerless phone still resting inside her coat pocket. She had sent the message believing no answer would ever come. Yet somehow, against every expectation she had allowed herself to imagine, the one person she had written to was now standing before her, proving that the truth she had nearly lost had finally found someone willing to hear it. Claire Bennett stood without moving, her blue eyes fixed upon the man she had only ever seen from distant public broadcasts. For a long moment she searched his face, almost expecting the image before her to disappear like a dream created by exhaustion. Yet the quiet certainty in Adrian Ashford's expression never wavered. He did not rush toward her. He did not overwhelm her with questions. Instead, he remained where he was, allowing her the space to decide whether she wished to take the next step. That single act of patience dissolved more fear than hurried reassurance ever could. Claire slowly lowered her eyes, drawing one careful breath before speaking. "I did not think anyone would actually read it," she whispered. Her voice carried little strength after the long night, yet every word remained clear. Adrian answered with the same calm steadiness that had first convinced countless citizens they could trust their king. "I read every message sent through the emergency justice line myself, when the system identifies unusual circumstances." He paused briefly before continuing. Yours did not ask for revenge. It asked for truth. That is why I came. Claire felt something inside her quietly loosen. During the endless hours alone beneath the falling snow, she had repeated those final words from her message countless times, wondering whether they had vanished into silence. Hearing that they had reached their destination felt almost impossible. The royal guard remained respectfully behind their king, speaking only in quiet whispers as the royal investigator carefully observed the surrounding area without interrupting the conversation. No one treated Claire as a suspect. No one demanded explanations before allowing her to breathe. The dignity she had been denied only a day earlier was returned through simple acts of respect. Adrian noticed the powerless phone still resting inside her gloved hand. "May I see it?" he asked gently. Claire hesitated only a moment before placing the silent device into his palm. Its battery had long since failed, but the cracked screen and worn edges revealed how carefully it had been carried. Adrian handed it to the investigator. "Recover every available record," he instructed. "Messages, location, history, deleted files, transmission logs. Preserve everything exactly as it is." The investigator accepted the phone with careful precision, understanding that even the smallest detail might later reveal the truth hidden beneath the official reports. Adrian then removed his own heavy winter cloak and stepped forward just enough to drape it across Claire's shoulders. The warm fabric settled around her like a shield against the bitter mountain wind. Claire instinctively tried to refuse. "Your Majesty, you will need this." Adrian offered the faintest smile. "I have an entire escort prepared for winter travel. You have only endured it." The quiet kindness behind those words reached Claire more deeply than grand promises ever could. She lowered her gaze as unexpected tears gathered in her eyes, not from sorrow this time, but from the unfamiliar feeling of finally being believed. Adrian did not comment upon her emotions. He simply waited until she looked up again. "Claire," he said softly, "from this moment forward you will not face this alone. I cannot promise what the investigation will uncover until every fact has been examined, but I can promise something else." His voice remained steady as snow drifted gently between the towering pines. "No one will decide your future without the truth standing beside you." Claire slowly nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of the royal cloak as though anchoring herself to the first certainty she had known since everything had fallen apart. Around them the silent forest remained unchanged, yet somehow it no longer felt like a place where hope had been abandoned. It had become the place where one unanswered message finally received the reply that changed everything. The journey back toward the capital began before the winter sun disappeared behind the northern mountains, yet no one hurried the pace. Adrian Ashford understood that reaching the palace 1 hour sooner mattered far less than ensuring Claire Bennet felt safe after everything she had endured. One of the royal guards carefully prepared a warmer horse for her, while another offered a fresh blanket and a flask of warm herbal tea. Every gesture remained quiet and respectful, never treating her as someone fragile, but as someone whose dignity deserved protection. Claire accepted their kindness with hesitant gratitude, still unfamiliar with receiving consideration instead of suspicion. As the small escort continued through the snow-covered forest, Adrian rode beside her rather than several yards ahead as protocol usually required. The silence between them never felt uncomfortable. It carried the calm rhythm of two people allowing trust to grow without forcing unnecessary conversation. After several miles, Claire finally spoke. She quietly explained how the village council had slowly isolated her after the death of an elder who had once defended her family. Rumors had gradually replaced facts. Ordinary misunderstandings had become official accusations. People she had greeted every morning stopped meeting her eyes. Friends who once shared meals with her began crossing the street to avoid speaking with her. None of it had happened overnight. It had arrived one small decision at a time, until she no longer recognized the community she had spent her entire life trying to serve. Adrian listened without interrupting. Years of leadership had taught him that truth often revealed itself most clearly when people were allowed to finish speaking without fear of immediate judgment. When Claire finished, he asked only a few careful questions about dates, names, and documents. The royal investigator quietly recorded every detail, while comparing her recollections with the evidence already collected from the forest. The damaged confession, the emergency transmission records, and the recovered travel route all pointed toward one unavoidable conclusion. Someone had carefully constructed a false narrative long before Claire ever realized she had become its target. As evening settled across the mountains, the escort reached a small royal outpost maintained for travelers crossing the northern pass. Lantern lights spilled warmly through frosted windows as caretakers welcomed the unexpected visitors inside. A physician assigned to the outpost examined Claire with gentle professionalism, confirming that she needed rest, warmth, food, and time, rather than emergency treatment. Adrian waited until the examination had concluded before entering the quiet sitting room where Claire rested beside a stone fireplace. Orange flames reflected softly across the room while melting snow dripped from boots arranged near the entrance. For the first time since receiving her message, Adrian removed the secure tablet from his travel bag and placed it upon the table between them. The screen displayed her final words exactly as she had written them. Claire looked at the message for several silent moments before lowering her eyes. Adrian touched the screen lightly before locking the record inside the Royal Archive system. "This message will never disappear," he said. "It is now preserved as official evidence under the protection of the Crown." Claire felt an unexpected weight lift from her heart. For days she had feared that her voice would vanish without leaving even the smallest trace behind. Now the truth she had nearly carried into silence had become part of the kingdom's permanent record. Adrian stood and looked toward the quiet snowfall beyond the window. Tomorrow they would return to the Northern Council, not with assumptions or anger, but with evidence, witnesses, and lawful authority. Tonight, however, justice did not begin with a courtroom or a royal decree. It began with something far simpler. A frightened woman who had believed she no longer mattered finally rested beneath a roof where no one questioned whether she deserved to be heard. 3 weeks later, the Northern Valley looked entirely different beneath the bright light of an early winter morning. Fresh snow still rested upon the rooftops and towering pine trees, but the silence that once carried fear had been replaced by quiet anticipation. Representatives from neighboring packs, royal investigators, and members of the Crown's Judicial Council stood together outside the village hall as the official findings were presented before the community. Every recovered document had been examined. Every communication record had been verified. Claire Bennett's phone had preserved the emergency transmission exactly as she had sent it, while additional records recovered by the Royal Intelligence Office revealed that official reports submitted to the Crown had been deliberately altered before leaving the village. Witnesses who had remained silent finally stepped forward after learning that the Alpha King himself had ordered complete protection for anyone willing to speak honestly. Piece by piece, the carefully constructed false story that had surrounded Claire quietly collapsed beneath the weight of verified truth. Adrian Ashford listened without satisfaction or anger. Justice, he believed, was never measured by humiliation but by restoring what had been wrongfully taken. When the proceedings concluded, the royal decree was read before every person gathered in the square. Claire Bennett's name was formally cleared of every accusation entered against her. All false records were permanently removed from the Crown archives and replaced with the documented findings of the investigation. The emergency message she had sent from the snowy forest remained preserved, not as evidence of guilt, but as the document that prevented the truth from disappearing forever. A gentle breeze carried snow across the village as Claire stood quietly near the front of the gathering, wearing the same simple winter coat she had worn on the day everything changed. She did not step forward seeking recognition. She did not ask anyone to apologize. The greatest victory had already arrived long before this morning, the moment someone had believed her enough to search for the truth. Adrian approached after the ceremony ended, no longer surrounded by officials or guards. For a few peaceful moments they simply walked together along the familiar road leading toward the frozen river, where Claire had once believed her future had ended. Sunlight reflected across the untouched snow, filling the valley with a quiet brilliance that neither of them needed to describe. Adrian finally broke the comfortable silence. "When you sent your message, what made you choose gratitude instead of anger?" Claire smiled softly while looking toward the distant mountains. "Because I could not control whether anyone answered," she replied. "I could only control the kind of person I remained while waiting." Adrian considered her words for several thoughtful moments before nodding with quiet respect. Throughout his years as Alpha King, he had witnessed strength displayed through power, influence, and authority. Yet standing beside Claire reminded him that another kind of strength often changed lives more deeply. It was the strength to remain honest after betrayal, compassionate after rejection, and hopeful after every reason to surrender had disappeared. As the royal escort prepared for the journey home, Adrian reached into his coat and returned Claire's restored phone. The battery had been replaced, the screen carefully repaired, and every recovered message safely preserved. Claire accepted it with both hands before noticing something unexpected. Her final message remained saved exactly as she had written it, but beneath it appeared one additional reply entered into the royal archive after Adrian first read her words. It contained only a single sentence. "The truth found me because you refused to let hope fall silent." Claire looked up, meeting Adrian's calm blue-gray eyes as a quiet smile crossed both their faces. Around them, the valley remained peaceful beneath the endless winter sky, and somewhere beyond the snow-covered mountains another person facing impossible circumstances might one day send one final message, never realizing that hope sometimes needed only one honest voice and one willing heart to change everything.